Christopher Nolan's Odyssey is a deconstruction of the blind bard's famous poem, and Christopher Nolan has run face first into a brick wall. For the same reason every other deconstruction has failed. Every single one. It's called the deconstruction paradox. Let's get into it, shall we?
Architectural Outcast.
In the late 60s and early 70s, the hip, new, trendy form of literary criticism was called postmodernism. And while it did seep into other areas of the culture, art, even architecture, history, philosophy, the other social sciences, always it was first and foremost a form of literary criticism. The whole point of the postmodern critique was to properly educate the unwashed masses, to tell them that they didn't understand those old stories, that those old stories didn't mean what they thought they meant, didn't mean what they'd been told they meant by nefarious forces. But have no fear, good citizen, the postmodern critic was here to tell you what those stories really meant, and they were naughty, naughty, naughty. The postmodern literary critique was only popular for about 10 years or so. Its rapid decline was for a number of reasons. First and foremost, the postmodern agenda was obvious, the attempt to destroy the old stories. Get rid of the past. Kill it if you have to. The second reason has to do with human nature. Even those who were down with the postmodern agenda didn't like to be told what to think, didn't like having a finger wagged in their face. But the reason why the postmodernists abandoned literary criticism is because they realized they were irrelevant. Unless you read the literary page of the New York Times on a regular basis, who gives a crap what a bunch of elitists and academics think about your favorite old stories? That's when the postmodernists turned to deconstruction. If no one will pay any attention to what they say about the story, they will just simply rewrite the story. And that's when they ran face first into the deconstruction paradox. The first half of the deconstruction paradox is that a deconstruction is not an independent, separate story capable of standing on its own 2 feet. Its very existence is completely dependent upon the original story, to the point that it requires the audience to have knowledge of that previous story. That's why most deconstructions fail without that knowledge. They're incomplete stories. Simply put, no story, no deconstruction. This is where we get to the second half of the deconstruction paradox. The deconstructionist will rewrite the story. Now we're in some sort of nebulous middle ground, where the deconstruction is inspired by, references, adjacent to the original story, but it's no longer the original story. It is a completely new story. This is where we get the bait and switch, where the deconstructionist pretends that they're critiquing the original story, but in reality, they're critiquing what they think the original story said, what they want the original story to say, or more often than not these days, tell us what the story should have said. Christopher Nolan is going to show us what the Odyssey was really like. He's going to strip away myth and legend, gods. He's going to make his epic historically accurate. He's going to make it grounded, realistic, and gritty. And he ran face first into the deconstruction paradox. Nolan's Odyssey is condescendingly smug in its open hostility towards gods, and it treats the people of the Odyssey as if they're idiots. Can you believe that these fools actually think that thunder, clouds, or whirlpools have anything to do with these made-up fictitious characters? By the way, did we tell you gods aren't real? I don't know about y'all. I don't think Zeus, Athena, Aphrodite, all their pals are real. I don't think they exist. But here's the dirty little secret that the deconstructionists want us to forget. It doesn't matter what I think, you think, doesn't matter what Christopher Nolan thinks. It doesn't matter if the Greek gods are real or not real in our world. In the world of the Odyssey, they are real. The gods are more than real. They drive the entire story. The Trojan War, Odysseus' 10-year Odyssey, it was all caused by a chump being dragged into an argument between three goddesses over who was more beautiful. All three goddesses tried to bribe that chump. He picked Aphrodite because she promised him the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. That chump was Prince Paris of Troy, and the most beautiful woman in the world was Helen, who just so happened to be married to another man. Athena took the side of the Greeks and then later took the side of Odysseus, partially because she was still pissed that Paris picked Aphrodite. Nolan's decision to strip the gods, the supernatural, magic out of the Odyssey is a fatal mistake that the movie never recovers from. Now, before you all start shouting, "There's magic in the Odyssey, Randy," there's Ciri, Calypso, the giants, the sirens, that Cyclops. Not so fast, my friends. The story is told from the perspective of Odysseus while he's high on lotus leaves. We don't know if what he said really happened or if he's just taking a bad trip, pun intended. By removing the gods, the supernatural, magic from the story, Nolan has removed the very reason all these events happened in the first place. We're just thrown into the middle of a story that just happened. Again, Nolan is relying on the audience to be familiar with Homer's Odyssey in the first place. That's why Nolan barely acknowledges the cause of the Trojan War. And when he does acknowledge it, he tries to reframe it while at the same time hand-waving it away. That's where we get the conversation between Odysseus and Penelope just before Odysseus leaves for the Trojan War. Penelope says, "Who cares if a married queen runs off with a foreign prince? They're just in love. They deserve happiness. Her husband, Menelaus, and his brother Agamemnon are just being jerks." This is where Nolan falls back on another classic deconstruction trope. What we're told is the cause of what happens in the story isn't true. But don't worry, fellow citizen, the Deconstructionist is here to save the day. They will educate you on what is really going on. In that same conversation, Penelope tells Odysseus, "We're just seeing wounded male pride. Menelaus is just upset that his wife ran off with another man. Once he and Agamemnon are through with their male posturing, they'll forget about it and move on." Odysseus says, No, not so fast. Agamemnon is just using Helen as an excuse, as cover for his real motives. He wants to take control of Troy's sea lanes. It's all about money. Here we are again, back at the classic deconstruction bait and switch. It is true that in our world, politicians often come up with all sorts of high-minded justifications for a war that the only reason they want is for money and power.
Randy, are you trying to convince us that an entire war would be fought over something like beauty?
Yes, that's exactly what the story says happens. As I said earlier, the whole thing was started by an argument between three goddesses about who was the most beautiful. Paris chose Aphrodite because she bribed him with the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. And when Paris met Helen, the most beautiful woman in the world, guess what? She fell in love with him, and vice versa. They ran off to Troy together. This caused Menelaus, Agamemnon, and pals to believe that the Trojans had stolen the most beautiful woman in the world. So they loaded up in their ships to go get her back. The story makes it very clear that the Trojans could have won the war on day one. All they had to do was give Helen back to Menelaus. But the Trojans don't want to do that because they want to keep the most beautiful woman in the world, and they thought they were in a strong enough position to tell the Greeks to go pound sand. Literally in this case. This gets to the biggest theme that deconstructionists absolutely hate and want to change at all costs: how the Iliad and Odyssey present beauty. Because modern-day deconstructionists absolutely hate beauty, particularly feminine beauty. We saw this open hostility towards Homeric beauty all through the lead up to the release of the Odyssey. Christopher Nolan, Lupita Nyong'o were going out of their way to say, yeah, we know Helen's famous for being beautiful and all, yeah, whatever. But what we're interested in is exploring who Helen is as a person, her inner beauty, if you will. This is where we get into symbolism, and why I keep saying, if y'all are going to mess around with symbolism, you better know what you're doing, because you might end up saying things you don't intend. And in some cases, don't even realize you're saying. When we finally meet Helen, she has a massive scar across the side of her face. Her beauty has been intentionally destroyed. And just in case you missed it, Menelaus draws attention to it and then mocks Helen. A face that launched 1,000 ships? Ha! More like a face that launched 500 ships. Oh boy, oh boy, oh boy. Nolan, you have really stepped in it this time. Now, this is a bit of a Gordian knot that we need to unravel. First off, there is nothing in the historic or literary record to indicate that Helen had her face damaged in any way, shape, or form, ever. And no one would have done it intentionally because, if for nothing else, it would have been seen as an act of sacrilege, a crime against the gods themselves. So this comes entirely from the mind of Christopher Nolan. This brings us back to deconstruction, because this is pure deconstructionist symbolism, to literally destroy the thing they hate. And oh, do they hate Helen. The hate and contempt for the source material oozes off almost every frame in this film, but nowhere is it on more display than the reveal of the destruction of Helen's beauty. Now, if Nolan had just hired a random actress of any race, shape, or form, and then had the reveal where her face was destroyed, the symbolism would be pretty straightforward. Nolan's trying to destroy Helen as an icon based upon her beauty. Okay, got it. But that's not what Nolan did. And this is where things take an interesting turn. Like I said, if you're going to mess with symbolism, you better know what you're doing. Both Christopher Nolan and Lupita Nyong'o took every opportunity in the interviews leading up to the release of the Odyssey to let us all know that once Christopher Nolan started this project, there was only one woman he wanted to portray his Helen of Troy, Lupita Nyong'o. And both also went out of their way to make it very clear neither one was interested in the part Helen's beauty played in the story. Granted, an important part, but oh no, they had no interest because, ew, ick, patriarchy, male gaze, female oppression. They wanted to explore Helen's personality, her strength, her power, her inner beauty. Nolan has made it abundantly clear that his goal from the outset was to destroy Helen as an icon based upon her beauty. Then he goes and hires Helen Nyong'o, who, despite being a beautiful woman in her own right, is not one of the most beautiful women in the world, much less the most beautiful woman in the world. And then he goes and puts a scar on her face. Now, add into that equation the race swap. This is why deconstruction is completely dependent upon the source material, and why trying to stuff modern-day politics into that source material leads to chaos. Helen is a well-established character where the sources clearly describe her appearance: blonde, fair of skin. Nolan sets out to destroy Helen, to make his Helen objectively less beautiful, and then he literally destroys that beauty. And the first thing he does in furtherance of that project is to race swap Helen. And then he virtue signals diversity and inclusion, drawing attention to the race swap. What are you saying, Nolan? Symbolism is a powerful tool, but it's a bitch. It will bite you every single time. There are 3 important women in the Odyssey. First off, there's Penelope, the loyal wife who's desperately trying to hold things together until Odysseus returns, and she never loses her belief that Odysseus will return. She is the woman that Odysseus is willing to literally walk through Hades to get back to. And then there's Circe and Calypso, who both want to possess Odysseus by any means necessary. Both women are evil. Intersectional feminism can't be having any of that, so all three characters were changed, leading to incoherent chaos. You can't portray Penelope as a loyal wife keeping the home fires burning. That would remove her agency. But what we see on screen is all over the place. Penelope tries to convince Odysseus to abandon their people and flee to the west, and gets miffed when Odysseus says, yeah, we could get away, but Ithaca would suffer. She has no sense of responsibility to her people, no sense of self-sacrifice. She's willing to abandon everybody to their fates as long as she gets what she wants. Later, when she's dealing with the suitors, publicly she's telling everybody, yep, we're waiting for Odysseus, so just hold your horses, boys. But in private, she's singing a completely different tune. He's not coming back, so we need to figure out how to get rid of those suitors. She's not preserving Ithaca for Odysseus. She's protecting her own position and power. There's that rage-fueled speech that's supposed to be the feminist empowerment moment. What about me? What about my knowledge? What about my experience? I should rule, but the only reason I can't is because I don't have stubble on my chin. We're supposed to assume that all that rage and venom is aimed at the suitors, but it comes off as being aimed at Odysseus because once he returns, she'd lose her power, and it's aimed at her son because once he comes of age, she loses her power. And then when Odysseus does return, they both peace out to the west. It comes off that if Penelope can't rule, she ain't going to let Odysseus rule. So why was Odysseus so desperate to return home? It's because the story demands that he be desperate to return home. It's definitely not because this particular Penelope was worth returning home to. Nolan had to really jump through some hoops in an effort to rehabilitate Circe. The first part of the interaction with Odysseus's men does make sense. You could understand how a woman alone would be frightened by a group of heavily armed men and might overreact and preemptively turn them into pigs before they could do anything. But then her personality completely changes once she meets Odysseus. She's charming, glib, sly, flirtatious, manipulative. She's supposed to be Odysseus's equal, a genuine threat that Odysseus is only able to overcome by dishonorable tactics, holding her sister hostage. We're supposed to be sympathetic to Circe. We're supposed to think she's an innocent woman living alone, minding her own business, forced to use whatever's to hand to protect herself from evil men. And they're evil because they're men. Circular logic. And it just so happens what's to hand? She's a witch. And to drive that point home, she chants, "Go back into your disguises," as she turns the pigs back into men. Nolan conveniently leaves out the part where Circe blackmails Odysseus with his men's lives, forcing him to stay with her, and they end up having a son together. But that would get in the way of the deconstruction, so whatever. But even as portrayed, Circe is still evil. She tries to trick Odysseus into killing and then eating one of his own men. She tries to trick him into becoming a cannibal. But we're still supposed to think Circe is an innocent victim. Whew, the things that Hollywood finds acceptable. And then there's Calypso, who makes absolutely no sense in this film. Now remember, in the original version, Calypso enslaves Odysseus and then drags him to her bed night after night after night for 7 years against his will. And Odysseus remembers all of it. Remembers that he has a family he's desperate to get to, and remembers he wants nothing to do with Calypso. And the only reason why she stops doing this is because the gods intervene, tell her to knock it off. And that's when she lets him go, reluctantly. Nolan's Calypso is just a kind, caring, loving woman who found this poor guy washed up on the beach, and she nursed him back to health. And because she was worried about his mental state, she gave him lotus leaves to help him forget his past. They fall in love and live happily for years. And then out of nowhere, of her own free will, because you can't show a woman being told what to do, she decides to help Odysseus remember his past and then convinces him to go home. Because we learn this whole journey was Odysseus' fault, because he really didn't want to go home because he was sad. Calypso is confusing because we don't know what she is. On one hand, she's just this random nice lady helping a poor guy out on the beach. But on the other hand, she knows too much. She's all-knowing. Odysseus would have never got home without her guidance and help. And just like Circe, we're supposed to be sympathetic to Calypso. Yeah, she got selfish and she kept Odysseus too long, 7 years, but it was for love. And she did the right thing at the end. She helped him remember, helped him get home. He wouldn't have got home without her help, right? But just like Circe, as portrayed, Calypso is still evil. She got a man addicted to drugs so it would be easier for her to manipulate and control him. Whew, the things that Hollywood finds acceptable. I could say a lot more about this movie, but I've been yammering on for a bit. So I'm going to conclude by talking about the symbolism of the architecture, because architecture is kind of my thing. Something I noticed in a film that's supposed to be grand and epic, there weren't very many grand and epic scenes. I mean, there were a few, mostly on the ocean, but the architecture in particular were all small, narrow, cramped, almost claustrophobic, and that was particularly true for Odysseus's palace. As far as what we see of the architecture of Troy, although having nothing in common with the architecture of the real Troy, I understand what Nolan was trying to accomplish, making it cramped and claustrophobic. He's trying to show Odysseus's perspective, how a random guy storming the city wouldn't have an overarching view. It would all be snapshots, bits and pieces. As far as Odysseus's palace, as shown in the movie, it has absolutely nothing in common with Mycenaean and Aegean palaces. Those things were massive, airy complexes full of light and color. Beautiful, well-designed homes, to the point you add modern amenities, running water, electric, Wi-Fi. Most people today would willingly move in. In fact, some of the most expensive villas around the Mediterranean are designed exactly like Mycenaean palaces. Mycenaean palaces were not dark, small, cramped, low-ceilinged, bare stone walls, smoke-filled hovels. But that brings us back to deconstructionist symbolism. Despite Odysseus claiming, "We're going to lose our wonderful palaces," the movie shows everybody living in and amongst ruins. Again, we're seeing the deconstructionist desire to destroy what they hate. In this case, what they hate is history. What they're saying is that history is dead. Just a bunch of empty ruins that offer no benefit to modern society. And the Odyssey, as a part of history, is just as irrelevant. The lessons that it teaches, not only are they irrelevant, they're naughty, stay away, danger, thus justifying Christopher Nolan changing the Odyssey to say what he thinks it should say. Personally, I'd have to go back to the 70s and movies like Buffalo Bill and the Indians and Heaven's Gate to find another movie as petty, mean-spirited, small-minded, resentful, and hated his source material as much as Christopher Nolan's Odyssey. But then again, that's just me. At any rate, I hope I gave you all something to think about, and until next time, y'all be safe.
Please like and subscribe. Please leave a comment.